In Scotland, the Green Party is inching closer to power. Reports suggest this week the Greens will be offered a ministerial post in the Scottish government. It won't be a coalition as such, but it will be enough to see both parties cooperate on things like the breakup of the UK. The Greens support the SNP's aim of another independence referendum. But what kind of party is Nicola Sturgeon getting into bed with? One of its critics says the Greens in Scotland bully, censor and intimidate. Who would say such a thing? Well, a former Green MSP would, you believe. His name is Andy Whiteman, who left the Greens last year amid acrimony about the party's unquestioning support for trans rights. He faced criticism for his outspoken support for freedom of speech on university campuses and the rights of biological women. Well, it's reported that some SNP figures look at how the Greens have been riven by rows over transphobia and worry it will further pick at the scab of their own internal disagreements. Earlier this year, Joanna Cherry was sacked from the SNP's front bench at Westminster, allegedly because of her conviction that being a woman is a biological fact. Let's turn to Spiked Online's Tom Slater, who joins us now. Tom, welcome to you. There are some people who say the Greens are losing sight of their core mission, which is to protect the environment.
Well, yes. I mean, that's one of the things that's so striking about this story is because over the summer, the Greens and the SNP has been trying to thrash out this cooperation agreement. And yet, whilst you see so much in which they're on the same page, as you say, the constitutional question, the separatist question, really, as well as a lot of green issues where they are kind of dancing on a head of a pin to a greater extent, it has actually hit a lot of roadblocks over the trans issue because, as you say, there's the Andy Whiteman situation, which I think really just demonstrates how all in the Scottish Greens are on the trans issue. And so he, again, as you say, walked out of the party in December. I mean, the straw that broke the camel's back is fascinating as far as he wanted to back an amendment by a Labour MSP that would allow victims of sexual violence to select the sex, that is not the gender identity, of the people who examine them, the sort of area which you wouldn't think would prove too controversial. Not so in the Scottish Greens. They're very much backing gender recognition, gender self-ID, which I'm sure you've discussed a lot of times in this show. And there's this perception that the SNP are soft on this issue as far as the Greens are concerned, to the point where even a lot of Green members called on them to call a halt to the deal. So as you say, it seems like this deal is going to come off, but striking that an issue that might strike people as quite fringe, but also not much to do with a Green party and their priorities, actually did throw up some genuine roadblocks there.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, this is not just a Green division. I was going to call it a Green problem. I mean, if it's a problem, that depends rather on your point of view, doesn't it? But it's a dividing line you've seen elsewhere. You mentioned Labour in Scotland. Labour in Westminster has had problems. I think it was Rosie Duffield, the Labour MP. There were calls from LGBT Labour to have the whip withdrawn from her because she was seen as, I think was a phrase used as insufficiently tough, sufficiently soft on trans rights. So this is affecting different parties, not just the Greens.
No, not at all. And I think one of the things that's quite striking about this discussion is it's really an argument that is going on within quote-unquote progressive politics. Now, I don't think there's a lot that is progressive about the Greens and the SNP as it happens to go, but that's a discussion for another time. But what is often presented as kind of hate-filled, hard-right transphobes on one side and lovely progressive liberal people on the other completely misses it. This is really an argument between, largely speaking, feminists, women on the left, and the trans activist side, who I think would find natural allies in those feminists. It wasn't for the overreach, the intolerance, and often the extremism of what passes for trans activism today. So that really is where the discussion is taking place. It's kind of within the left, if you like, that this is most heated, it feels like.
Yeah, so you have a situation where someone like J.K. Rowling is backing Joanna Cherry, who was on the SNP Westminster front bench until she was sacked because she was seen as too critical of trans rights. And all this stuff, it smacks. There's a whiff of sort of students' union politics about the whole thing. It must be. I mean, if you are a committed Green, and someone like Andy Whiteman, everything I've read about him suggests he absolutely was committed to that, advancing that environmentalist agenda, you are going to be terrified, worried at the very least, that in obsessing about what is quite a marginal and to some degree for many people quite an abstract question about trans rights is going to alienate loads of potential voters. And if you are a Green politician, you're in the business of attracting voters. Without them, you don't get to change anything.
This is what's so striking. It's almost like, for its adherents, gender ideology has to come before everything else. It has to conquer or before it. I think we saw that in the last Westminster election, where you saw various Lib Dem MPs, being coaxed onto a discussion of whether or not they actually believe in biological sex and struggling to answer that question. They're in a situation where they're trying to gain the votes of most of their countrymen, and yet this is the sort of issue they get caught up on. But I think all of that just speaks to the fact that for whatever reason, there is a remarkable level of orthodoxy on this question and enforced orthodoxy on this question, and a small margin of pretty extreme trans activists, who are always distinguished from trans people themselves, have managed to set the terms of debate and enforce what are, at the end of the day, quite extreme opinions on that discussion. And I think the Andy Whiteman letter is a perfect example of this. All he's really calling for is openness and tolerance of dissent. But for whatever reason, it seems like this trans movement cannot brook that kind of dissent on these questions.